Hello, my name is Aidan LaFrankie, and today I'll be going over the social phenomenon of terrorism. Specifically, I'll be focusing on Robert Pape's Donald Black's papers of terrorism. Firstly, we have Pape. Pape's paper is called The Specific Logic of Suicide Terrorism. Pape's main focus is on suicide terrorism and the aspects of suicide terrorism. Pape says that the primary driver of terrorism is foreign occupation by a democratic state. Says that the motivation is usually nationalism or a last stand to preserve their way of life. He argues that the only effective solution to combat suicide terrorism is to pull out the occupying forces or meet certain demands. Now, suicide terrorism is structurally different from regular terrorism or regular terroristic acts. Suicide terrorism is different in the aspect that the people committing these acts of terrorism are not trying to preserve their own way, or not trying to preserve their own lives. They're just simply trying to cause as much destruction and chaos as possible. That's why it's so much harder to stop. Some of the propositions that Pape makes in his paper relate to responses to occupation, strategic goals, and the effectiveness. The first the first proposition I'm using is when foreign military occupation happens, it's more likely that suicide attacks will occur. The second proposition relates to the first proposition in the way that he says suicide attacks vary directly with the governmental type, i.e. democracies. Now, suicide attacks, according to Pape, are overwhelmingly against democratic nations. Specifically, when it's a foreign occupation from a democratic nation, Pape says that suicide terrorists or terrorists in general see democracies as a lot softer, following the will of their people, more likely to give in to the demands to be met as they've seen in past success. The past success part leads me to the effectiveness, which is the last proposition I have. It is when there is more past success from suicide attacks, this makes suicide attacks more likely to occur. Pape uses that in seeing from past successes. I think specifically he used Hamas in his paper, seeing that they've had past success, they've had certain aspects of their demands being met, which leads to suicide attacks more likely to be used in the future because of that past success. And looking at the paradigm that is used in this paper, I found it was rational choice theory. Pape says that it is rational choice theory because these suicide terrorists and these terrorists are rational actors. Even if it may seem irrational from a viewpoint of an American. He says that they are trying to achieve specific political goals through coercion of a smaller actor coercing a larger actor through these acts of suicide terrorism. He says this is a rational choice because they are weighing the costs and the benefits. The benefits in this is being nationalism and getting rid of foreign occupation, and the cost would be human life. Now, moving on to Donald Black's paper of Geometry of Terrorism. He focuses on social distance, cultural distance, relational distance, and inequality. Now, some of the propositions that Donald Black uses relate to labeling of terrorism, likelihood of terrorism, and the relationships of people and how that leads to violence and terrorism. Relational distance is Donald Black says the likelihood of an act of violence being labeled terrorism increases as the social and relational distance between the perpetrator and the target increases. He says that the closer that groups of people are to each other, the more likely that violent acts or terroristic acts are likely to occur. He says that if they were very separated from each other and these people never interacted, there would never be any acts or there would rarely be acts of violence and terrorism because they wouldn't be interacting with each other. Second proposition, he says, is that terrorism is more likely to be labeled if it is an attack against citizens or an established institution. Us as citizens are seen as a protected class. When people who are killed by terrorists are just regular people, they're not military or anything, then it is way more likely to be labeled as a terroristic act if it's against a religious institution or a governmental building as well. Third proposition he makes is that terrorism is likely to be labeled when a news outlet reporting on the violence is socially close to the target and socially distant from the perpetrator. Social distance was a big focus of his paper, relational distance as well, saying that if we are all relationally alike or culturally alike, then there will be less acts of suicide or of terrorism in general, and that these different cultures and these different relations and this tension is what leads to acts of terrorism. Now, the paradigm used, I found it to be a mixture of opportunity theory and pure sociology. Now, granted, the main paradigm in the paper is pure sociology, but I put in opportunity theory as well because I think that in regards to relational and cultural distance, the closer that they are to each other, the more opportunity that is presented to commit these acts of terrorism. For pure sociology, Donald Black says that it focuses on social life and social structures. This is what he calls geometry or social geometry. It says that social life and actions vary with its geometric arrangement in the social space, relating to cultural and relational distance again. Now, looking at predictions made from both, we can go to Pape first. Pape says that if the acts of suicide terrorism are seeing success in the past and in the present, they are more likely to continue to occur into the future. For the predictions that Black makes, I focused on the technological aspect of his paper. He says that in the long run, he thinks that technology will lead to a decrease in terrorism, but in the short-term run, it will lead to an increase in terroristic acts because of more access to weapons or more access to where people are, how connected you are, but he thinks that connection in the long run could lead to a decrease in terroristic acts. Testability. So these could be tested. I know that Pape does have some certain amount of testability to his because he looks at the past events of suicide terrorism and the success it sees and how it leads to the success in the present with these terroristic acts. Donald Black could be tested as well. You could take two countries that have disdain towards each other, dislike towards each other, that are in close proximity to each other, and relate those acts of violence and terrorism to, say, two countries that are further away from each other or that don't interact with each other. Practical applications. I think counterterrorism is probably the best practical application to be used to try and combat the terroristic acts. If you look at the different aspects, Black's paper focuses more on terrorism as a social phenomenon in the geometric social space, while I think that Pape's paper focuses more on the instrumental use of suicide terrorism, what they can get from it, and the strategic use of suicide terrorism. In looking at which paper is more generalized, I think that it would have to be Donald Black because Pape's paper focuses mainly and specifically on suicide terrorism. It's more focused in, while Black's paper is more generalized on terrorism as a whole. Thank you.